True scary stories from Reddit. Creepypasta of a haunted college hostel. I've always been the kind of person who doesn't buy into ghost stories or supernatural phenomena. I mean, it's 2025. There's always an explanation for everything, right? But after what happened to me in that old college hostel, I'm not so sure anymore. I'm posting this here on Reddit because I need to get it off my chest, and maybe, just maybe, you'll understand. I've told a few friends about it, but they just brushed it off, as if it was all just some bizarre coincidence or a weird hallucination. I guess that's easier to believe than the truth. But what if the truth is worse than you can imagine? The hostel where I live is one of those old, crumbling buildings they never bothered to renovate. It's been here for decades, maybe longer, and it's surrounded by stories. Whispered conversations in the dorms, nervous laughter in the cafeteria. Everyone has their own version of what's been going on here, but one thing is always the same. Something's not right. The walls seem to have eyes, the floors creak with secrets, and sometimes, just sometimes, it feels like the air itself is heavy with something watching. I didn't really think much about it at first. You know, just typical college rumors. People talk. It's like that everywhere. But the first night I moved in, something was off. There was this strange chill in the air that I couldn't explain, no matter how many blankets I piled on myself. And the way the shadows seemed to stretch just a little too far at night. Well, that kind of stuff makes you feel like a kid again, doesn't it? Anyway, I've been living here for a few months now, and at first it wasn't so bad. But then, well, let's just say I've had two experiences that I can't shake, and I think they're connected. You won't believe me at first, I'm sure. It's hard to believe, even for me, and I was there. But these two events, they happened here in this hostel. And no matter how much I try to rationalize them, no matter how many sleepless nights I've spent lying awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling, I still don't have an answer. All I know is that these events, these things that happened, are far from normal, and they're still unresolved, still unexplained. They happened, and they're not going away. So, before I go any further, let me tell you, you'll have your doubts. You'll want to chalk it up to tired eyes or a bad dream, or even something your brain conjured up to mess with you. But let me tell you, if you don't believe me now, I guarantee you'll start thinking differently by the end of this. Just keep reading, and don't look away. Story 1. The Mirror in Room 13. The first time I stepped foot into Room 13, I thought it was a joke. I mean, how cliche could it get? Room 13? Seriously? Everyone knows the stories about the number 13, right? It's supposed to be unlucky, haunted, and just, well, eerie. But when you're a freshman in college, you don't get to choose where you live, especially when there are 1,000 students scrambling for a room. So, I guess it was fate, or maybe just bad luck, that led me and my new roommate, Daniel, to this cursed dorm room. At first, we were excited like most students are. New school, new beginnings, new adventures. The usual. And for the first few days, everything was fine. We were still in that honeymoon phase, you know? The excitement of a fresh start, making new friends, staying up late chatting about everything under the sun. But there was something about the room itself, something that didn't sit right. The other students had warned us, of course. Room 13, huh? Hope you're ready for some creepy experiences. One of the upperclassmen had said with a laugh that was just a little too forced. Another one, a girl who lived down the hall, told us we'd be better off staying away from that room. Bad things happen there, she said with a nervous glance over her shoulder. Trust me, don't go near it after dark. We brushed it off. After all, every dorm has its rumors. It's just part of the college experience, right? But something was off. I didn't want to admit it, but as we started to settle in, I felt a chill in the air. It wasn't just the cold drafts you sometimes get in older buildings. This was something more, something unnatural. It started small, a flicker of the light above the desk, followed by an odd silence that seemed to settle over the room. The kind of silence where you swear you hear your heartbeat in your ears. At first, we blamed it on the electrical wiring, typical for a dorm that hadn't been renovated in decades. But then came the whispers. They were faint at first, almost like the rustling of leaves in the wind, or maybe just the sound of the old building settling. But as the nights wore on, they grew louder, more distinct. At first, Daniel thought I was just imagining it. He'd laugh and tell me it was just the pipes or the wind, but I knew that it was something else. I could hear my name being called, low and slow, like a soft breath in my ear. And once or twice, I thought I saw something move in the corner of my eye, just a shadow, nothing more. But it was enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. One night, when the whispers seemed to grow louder and the air felt heavier than usual, I decided to investigate. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I felt like there was something in this room, something I needed to uncover. I went to bed later than usual that night, waiting for Daniel to fall asleep so I could do some exploring on my own. I had noticed a strange loose brick near the base of the wall earlier in the week, and curiosity gnawed at me. With the dim light of my desk lamp casting long shadows across the room, I got up and walked over to the spot. The brick wasn't loose enough to fall out on its own, but it shifted when I pressed against it. I felt a cold rush of air as the wall creaked, and my heart skipped a beat. I pulled at the brick, and with some effort, it came loose. Behind it, a small, dusty leather-bound diary lay hidden, its pages yellowed with age. I wiped off the dust and opened it carefully, my fingers trembling. The writing inside was neat but old-fashioned, dated back to the 1960s. The entries at first seemed harmless, even mundane. Someone had written about the daily routines of dorm life, exams, friendships, classes. But then, the tone of the writing began to change. The entries became darker, more paranoid. I swear I'm being watched. One entry read, "Every time I look in the mirror, I see someone standing behind me. But when I turn around, there's no one there. The whispers are getting louder. I can't escape them." I flipped through more pages, each one more disturbing than the last. The author of the diary, a student who had lived in this very room before me, described strange occurrences. The same flickering lights, the cold drafts, the shadows moving in the corner of her vision. But the most unsettling part was about the mirror. "The mirror is watching me," the entry said. "Every time I look into it, I see things that aren't there. I saw her last night, standing behind me, just out of the reflection. I tried to scream, but I couldn't. I think she's still here. I think she's watching me through the glass." My stomach churned as I read. The words were chilling, but what hit me the hardest was the description of the mirror. The exact same mirror hanging above the desk, the one that I had seen reflecting the shadows late at night. I closed the diary quickly, my breath coming in short gasps. I had to know more. I had to find out what had happened to the person who had written this. But as I looked up from the diary, I froze. The room felt colder. The whispers were back, louder now, echoing off the walls. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and I saw it. In the mirror, there was someone standing behind me. I didn't dare move. My reflection stared back at me, but there was something wrong with it. It wasn't just the usual reflection. There was a shadow, a dark figure, lurking behind me. I could see it in the corner of my eye, its shape shifting, but when I looked directly at it, nothing was there. I wasn't imagining it. This wasn't some trick of the light. Someone or something was in the room with me, and I wasn't sure if it was going to stay in the mirror or if it would come out. As the days passed, the strange occurrences in room 13 only grew more intense, more palpable. What started as faint whispers and flickering lights turned into something far more sinister, something that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. I found myself jumping at every sound, flinching at every shadow. It was as though the very walls of the room had become a trap, closing in around me, pressing in with an unseen, suffocating force. It began with the whispers. At first, they were soft, barely audible, as though the walls themselves were speaking to each other. But then they started to grow louder, more distinct, until I could hear them clearly in the dead of night. Sometimes they were no more than a breathless hiss, but other times they were words. My name, dragged out in a slow, mocking tone, would echo in the darkness. "Leah, Leah." The first few times I thought it was just my imagination, or maybe the wind playing tricks on me. But the more it happened, the more I began to question myself. It wasn't normal. It couldn't be. The shadows, too. They were the worst. At first, I tried to chalk it up to the natural light of the room, the way it shifted during the day. Then I started to see them, dark, shifting shapes, moving just at the edge of my vision. Whenever I looked directly at them, they would vanish, leaving nothing but the empty space in front of me. I would turn to Daniel, desperate for reassurance, but he always seemed unaware of what I was seeing. He thought I was just tired, stressed from schoolwork. But I knew something was wrong with this room. The mirror was the worst part. It wasn't just a mirror. It was an old, cracked thing, its frame worn and chipped, its glass stained with time. But every night, when the room fell into darkness, I would catch glimpses of things in the reflection, things that weren't there in the room. Figures standing behind me, their faces blurred, their shapes dark and undefined. At first, I thought it was just the shadows playing tricks, but the more it happened, the more convinced I became that the mirror was hiding something it wasn't letting me see. One night, after yet another restless sleep, I woke to find myself drenched in sweat. The whispers had been louder than ever, and when I sat up in bed, my gaze immediately went to the mirror. I could see something in it, something moving behind me. My breath hitched as I turned around, only to find the room completely empty. My heart was pounding now, the sense of dread pooling in my chest. But it was when I turned back to the mirror that I froze. There standing in the reflection was Daniel. But it wasn't him. It was an image of him. His face contorted in terror, his mouth open as though screaming, but no sound came out. I reached out a trembling hand, but the moment I did, the reflection shifted and Daniel was gone. The mirror was empty once again. I scrambled back, the blood draining from my face, my body shaking uncontrollably. It wasn't just the room that was haunted. It was us. Somehow, the room, its history, was bleeding into our lives, and it was starting to change us. The next morning, I tried to talk to Daniel about it, but he was distant, more distant than usual. He kept to himself, burying his head in his textbooks, barely responding when I spoke to him. I brushed it off at first. College was stressful after all, but then, as the days went on, his behavior became even stranger. He'd leave the room at odd hours of the night, only to return in the early morning with a vacant expression. When I asked where he had been, he would just shrug and say he had been walking, clearing his head. It wasn't like him to act this way. He was always the upbeat, easygoing type. But now, there was something off about him, something I couldn't put my finger on. Then, one night, I woke up to find the bed beside me empty. Daniel was gone. I sat up, panic creeping in as I searched the room with frantic eyes. The door to our dorm room was still locked, and there were no signs of anyone having entered or left. My heart pounded in my chest as I pulled on my shoes and rushed out of the room, desperate to find him. I ran down the hall, calling his name, my voice echoing in the empty corridors. I found him in the lounge, staring blankly at the wall. He didn't even react when I called to him, just continued to sit there, unmoving, as though lost in thought, or lost in something else entirely. I grabbed his arm, shaking him, and when he finally turned to look at me, his eyes were empty. Void. Hollow. Daniel, are you okay? I asked, my voice trembling. He blinked slowly, as if he was waking up from a deep sleep. Then, in a low, almost monotone voice, he said, I don't know. I don't know anymore. It was then that I realized something was terribly wrong. Whatever had taken hold of me, whatever had been tormenting me in that room, was now feeding on Daniel too. And I didn't know how much longer either of us could hold on. I couldn't keep going like this. I had to find out what was happening, what was haunting us in this cursed room. So, with no other option left, I went to the hostel warden. I had heard rumors about the warden's knowledge of the building's dark past, but I never thought I'd need to ask for his help. Now, though, I was desperate. He looked at me strangely when I explained what was happening, but eventually, after a long pause, he leaned forward and began to speak in hushed tones. You're not the first to experience this, he said, his voice low, heavy with the weight of years. Room 13, it's been sealed off a few times before for good reason. There's a history there, one that goes back a long time. The room was the site of a death, a very mysterious death. No one knows exactly what happened, but after that, strange things started happening to the students who lived there. People have reported the same things you've described. Whispers, shadows, strange occurrences. Some of them even claimed the room called to them. The death was never solved, and to this day, the room's history remains shrouded in secrecy. I felt my blood run cold as I listened. Who died? The warden's eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite place. A student, a young woman, several decades ago. She was found dead in that room, but there was no sign of foul play. The investigation was closed quickly, but many believe the death wasn't an accident. They say her spirit is still there, trapped in the room, watching, waiting. The warden fell silent, his face shadowed with a look I couldn't quite decipher. I suggest you move out of that room as soon as you can, he added, his voice grave. Before it's too late. But it already felt too late. The shadows had already taken root in our lives. The night after the warden's cryptic warning, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, my mind racing with thoughts of room 13, the cursed mirror, and the shadow that now loomed over my every waking moment. I couldn't stay in that room any longer. I couldn't bear the weight of the whispers, the shadows, the eyes that watched us from the depths of the mirror. But what terrified me most wasn't the haunting. It was the idea that we were trapped in a cycle, unable to escape. That every night, no matter how far I ran, the curse would follow me. Follow us. Daniel had become a shell of himself. The more time we spent in that room, the more withdrawn he became. I would wake up in the middle of the night to find him standing in front of the mirror, staring at his own reflection with wide, unblinking eyes. His lips would be moving, but there were no words, just the occasional whisper of a name I couldn't make out. At first, I thought he was sleepwalking, but after the warden's revelation, I began to fear that something far darker was at play. I had to do something. I had to end this. In the dead of night, I made up my mind. I was going to destroy the mirror. It had to be the source of everything. The whispers, the shadows, the curse. If I could destroy it, maybe I could break the cycle, free us from whatever had latched onto us. I grabbed the largest object I could find in the room, a chair, and approached the mirror with trembling hands. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest that I could barely hear the low whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. The glass seemed to shimmer, almost alive, as if it was aware of my intentions. I raised the chair high above my head, and before I could change my mind, I swung it with all my strength. The sound of glass shattering was deafening, and for a moment, I thought I had won. But then, the mirror didn't just shatter, it reformed. Pieces of glass lifted off the floor and reattached themselves, as if they were being pulled together by an invisible force. I watched, frozen in horror, as the mirror became whole again, its surface smooth and flawless, as though it had never been broken. And that was when I heard it, a voice, deep and cold, reverberating through the room. It wasn't just a whisper this time. It was a command, an invitation, a warning. You cannot escape. I stumbled back, falling onto the floor, my mind reeling. The entity controlling the mirror was far more powerful than I had imagined. Destroying it wasn't enough. It was tied to something beyond my understanding, something ancient, something far older than me, or Daniel, or the room itself. Desperation clawed at my insides as I scrambled to my feet. I had to find a way to end this. There had to be something, some secret, some ritual I could perform to break the curse. But what? How? The warden's words echoed in my mind. Her spirit is still there, trapped in the room, watching, waiting. The curse wasn't just about the mirror. It was tied to something far more insidious, to a death that had never been solved, to a spirit that could never rest. I had to know the truth. I had to find out what happened all those years ago. I ran back to the warden's office, my heart pounding in my chest, determined to get the answers I needed. He was sitting at his desk when I arrived, a knowing look in his eyes, as though he had been expecting me. "You didn't destroy it, did you?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Spot. I tried, but it wouldn't break. It just reformed. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. What happened in that room? What really happened to the student who died? The warden looked at me for a long time, his eyes heavy with regret. Then he sighed deeply and stood up from his desk, walking over to a dusty old cabinet in the corner. He pulled out a faded file, the yellowed paper crinkling as he handed it to me. Her name was Emily. She was a student here many years ago. She was bright, well-liked until she started staying in room 13. At first, everything seemed fine. But then she started to change. She became distant, withdrawn. Her friends said she talked about seeing things, hearing things. They didn't believe her at first. Who would? But then one night, she was found dead in that very room. No marks, no wounds. It looked like she had just stopped breathing. The investigation was closed quickly. No one ever found out what really happened. I flipped through the file, reading the sparse notes. Nothing concrete, just vague reports about strange happenings, whispers, and shadows. But it was the last line that caught my attention. Emily's body was never found. Some believe she was taken by the mirror. I felt my blood run cold. Taken by the mirror? What did that mean? Was it possible that her spirit had been trapped there, inside the reflection? Was she still inside the glass, watching, waiting? You have to leave, the warden said softly, as though reading my thoughts. You and your roommate. Curse is tied to that room, to the mirror. It feeds on fear, on desperation. If you don't leave now, you'll be pulled into it. Just like Emily. I shook my head, trying to make sense of everything. But what about Daniel? What about me? We can't just leave without knowing what's happening. The warden's gaze grew sad. The curse will continue, whether you stay or leave. You can't break it, but you can stop feeding it. You can sever the connection. Move out of the room. Leave, for your own sake. I left his office in a daze, the file clutched tightly in my hands. It felt as though everything I thought I knew had been turned upside down. The curse wasn't just something supernatural. It was a cycle, a pattern that repeated itself over and over again, drawing in students one by one until they became part of the darkness, part of the reflection in the mirror. I couldn't help but wonder, though, was the curse truly over, or had it merely been postponed? The mirror had reformed after I tried to destroy it. The entity had spoken. It had waited for me to make a move. And now, with the knowledge of what had happened to Emily, I wondered if the cycle would simply continue with someone else. As I left room 13 for the last time, I glanced back over my shoulder, the weight of the room's history pressing down on me. Was the curse truly broken? Or had I just opened the door for something far worse to come? The air felt colder now, as though the room was still watching me, waiting for the next chapter of its story to unfold. Story 2, the rooftop party. I had heard the rumors for weeks, whispered conversations in the hallways, and hushed warnings from people who'd been around longer than me. The old residence hall on the outskirts of campus, abandoned for years, was the stuff of legends. Students spoke of the strange things that had happened there. The flickering lights, the cries echoing through the halls late at night, and the eerie feeling that never left the building. It had been sealed off long ago, but that only made it more tantalizing. The building had become a symbol of the forbidden, the place where curious students dared to venture, only to return with stories they couldn't quite explain. So when I got the invitation to the rooftop party, I was both intrigued and terrified. It was an invitation that wasn't supposed to exist. An unspoken rule amongst the students was that the building was off limits. But a text appeared on my phone one evening from an unknown number. Meet us on the roof tonight. Don't miss it. I had no idea who had sent it, but I knew exactly what it was, an invitation to the infamous rooftop party. It was the kind of thrill you couldn't pass up, a chance to defy the rules and take part in something that everyone talked about, but few had the guts to experience. A chance to feel the pulse of the campus in a way you couldn't get from a regular dorm party. It was a chance to be part of something bigger. But as much as I felt the pull, there was a sense of dread hanging over me. Everyone knew the building's dark past. There had been disappearances, unexplained deaths, and some even said the place was haunted by the ghosts of students who'd never left. And yet, I couldn't ignore the adrenaline coursing through my veins. The decision was made before I even realized it. I told my friends about the invitation, and unsurprisingly, they were just as excited. There were a few who were nervous, some who hesitated, but in the end, the allure of the forbidden was too strong. We all decided to go. We met up at the entrance of the abandoned building as the sun set, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as though the building was watching us approach. As we stepped inside, the smell of mold and decay hit us like a wall. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and the floorboards creaked ominously beneath our feet. But there was an excitement in the air, a strange energy that urged us forward. We made our way to the staircase, climbing to the top of the building. The rooftop door was already open, and as we stepped out onto the cold concrete, we were greeted by a scene that was both familiar and eerie. A few people were already gathered, chatting and laughing, with a makeshift bar set up in the corner. String lights flickered weakly above us, casting long shadows across the rooftop. It was like any other party at first, but the air felt different, charged with something I couldn't quite put my finger on. We grabbed drinks and mingled with the others, all the while keeping a careful eye on the dark corners of the roof, where the shadows seemed to move more than they should. The wind howled around us, but the atmosphere was alive with excitement. People were talking, laughing, daring each other to explore the building's dark corners, and even telling ghost stories about the history of the place. The thrill of the forbidden seemed to heighten everything, making even the smallest noises feel like a part of the night's dark mystery. As the evening wore on, though, things started to feel off. At first, it was just little things, an odd chill in the air, a sense that we were being watched. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just my nerves. But as the night went on, the strange occurrences became harder to ignore. Then it happened, the first strange event. It was around midnight, and the party was in full swing. Everyone was dancing, chatting, and having a good time. But then, something caught my attention. A noise. It started as a faint tapping sound, coming from the far corner of the rooftop. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe someone tapping their fingers on the railing. But the sound grew louder, more deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I glanced around, but no one seemed to notice. The others were lost in their own conversations, oblivious to the noise. I excused myself from my friends and walked toward the sound, my footsteps echoing in the still night air. As I got closer, the tapping stopped. I froze, staring into the shadows. The corner of the rooftop was barely illuminated by the string lights, and all I could see was a dark, empty space. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a strange chill creeping up my spine. There was no one there. I turned to leave, thinking I had just imagined it, when I heard a voice behind me. "Did you hear that?" I spun around, my pulse racing, but no one was there. I was alone, yet the voice had been so real, so clear. My breath caught in my throat as I walked back to the party. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the energy of the night had shifted in a way that I couldn't explain. Something was out of place, and I had a sinking feeling that it wasn't just my nerves. I wasn't sure what it was, but I couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread gnawing at my gut. As I rejoined my friends, I tried to push the unease aside, telling myself that it was just the atmosphere of the night playing tricks on my mind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me from the shadows. And I wasn't the only one who felt it. One by one, guests began to disappear. At first, it was just a few people slipping away, sneaking off to explore the building or go home. But then it started happening more often. People who had been standing next to us just moments ago were suddenly gone. One friend vanished without a trace, and another was found standing alone in the dark hallway of the building, muttering to herself as though in a trance. Panic began to set in, and I could feel the tension building in the air. Someone suggested we leave, but the door to the stairwell was locked. It was as though the building itself was keeping us trapped there. Suddenly, the tapping started again. This time louder, closer. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from behind us, from the far corner of the rooftop. But when we turned to look, no one was there. A cold wind whipped across the rooftop, and the lights flickered. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as the other guests began to murmur, their faces filled with fear. The air was thick with unease, and it felt like someone was right there, watching us from the dark. The tapping continued, each sound a reminder that something was lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The party had turned into a nightmare, and it was only just beginning. The laughter and music had been the perfect soundtrack to a night of recklessness and excitement. For a moment, it seemed like just another wild party, one that we'd brag about later. telling stories of our daring feats and the dangerous places we'd gone. But as the night wore on, a sense of discomfort crept over me and my friends. It was subtle at first, nothing obvious. A chill in the air, a flicker in the corner of my vision, but nothing I could explain. At least, not yet. The first true sign that something was wrong came when I noticed it. A shadow, darker than the night around it, shifting at the edge of the rooftop. It wasn't cast by any of us, nor by any of the flickering lights strung above. At first, I thought it was just one of the other party-goers, maybe someone on the fringe of the crowd, but as I watched, it became clear that this person was different. The figure stood motionless at the corner of the roof, near the low railing that overlooked the city. Its posture was off, almost unnatural. The head was tilted at a sharp angle, as though the person, if they were even a person, was trying to look at something they shouldn't be able to see. The figure was obscured by the darkness around it, but there was something terribly wrong about the way it moved. When it did, its limbs jerked like a puppet whose strings had been pulled too tight, awkward and stilted. I stared, unsure if I was seeing things. But then the others started to notice, too. I caught the worried glances of my friends, all of us suddenly very aware of the figure standing alone. The atmosphere shifted, and an unspoken agreement passed between us. Something was wrong. Before anyone could say anything, the figure moved again, but this time it was different. It wasn't walking. It was gliding, its feet barely touching the ground, as though it was hovering. My stomach dropped. I turned to my friends, but their faces mirrored my own growing sense of unease. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure was gone. It vanished into the night, as though swallowed by the shadows themselves. I don't know what made us look away, but when I glanced back to where it had stood, there was nothing there. Did you guys see that? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Everyone nodded, their eyes wide with disbelief. None of us had said a word, but it was clear. We were no longer just at a party. Something had changed. As we tried to laugh it off and return to the festivities, the air around us seemed to thicken. The breeze, which had once been cool and refreshing, now carried a biting chill. It didn't feel like a normal wind. It felt heavy, as though it was pushing against us. I shivered involuntarily and pulled my jacket tighter around me. That was when I heard voices. At first, I thought it was just the crowd, conversations blending into a cacophony of noise. But then I noticed something strange about the voices. They didn't belong. They sounded distorted, as if they were being played backward or through static, unintelligible whispers rising and falling in a pattern that didn't make sense. It was unnerving, and I couldn't focus on any one voice long enough to make out what was being said. It felt like the air itself was alive with murmurs, like unseen figures were conversing just out of earshot, and I was left straining to understand something that wasn't meant to be understood. Then came the cold. It wasn't just the wind this time. It was something else, a sudden drop in temperature, like the heat of the night had been sucked away in an instant. I looked around, trying to see if anyone else had noticed, but the others were already reacting. They pulled their jackets tighter, rubbing their arms as they shivered. "We need to get inside," one of my friends said, her voice tight with fear. But before anyone could respond, something even more unsettling happened. Sarah, one of my closest friends, suddenly stopped talking. She had been standing beside me just moments ago, laughing at some dumb joke, but now she stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the far corner of the rooftop, staring at nothing. Her body was rigid, as though she was frozen in place. I called her name, but there was no response. She didn't blink, didn't move an inch. Her skin had turned pale, and her face was drained of all color, as though all the life had been sucked from her. Panic set in, and we tried to pull her out of the trance. But when I touched her arm, it felt wrong. There was no warmth in her skin, as though the life had completely drained out of her. Her eyes, though wide open, were unseeing, locked on the corner of the rooftop. I felt my heart race as I tried to shake her, but it was as if she couldn't hear me. Her pupils were dilated, her gaze still fixed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she blinked, and with that single motion, she was back. She gasped and stumbled, looking around confused. "What happened?" she asked, her voice shaky. You were just standing there," like you couldn't move or hear us," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head, clearly unable to explain what had just happened. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and she clutched at my arm for support. And that's when it hit me. The figure, the unnatural movements, the distorted voices, Sarah's trance, the wind, the cold. It wasn't just a random haunting. It was all connected. "Let's leave now," I said, my voice urgent. But when we tried to head toward the door that led inside, we were stopped. The door, the only way in or out, was locked. Panic set in as I grabbed the handle, shaking it desperately, but it wouldn't budge. The windows, too, were sealed tight, no matter how hard we tried to open them. We were trapped. That's when we realized the truth. The figure wasn't just some random person. It wasn't even human. It was something else, something far older and darker than we could have imagined. And this building, this cursed, abandoned place, was never just haunted by ghosts. It was trapped in time, bound by a curse that pulled people in and kept them there. And no matter how hard we tried to escape, the roof, the entire building, seemed determined to keep us. Panic surged through my veins as we scrambled toward the door, our collective desperation amplifying with every second. We pulled, pushed, and rattled the handle, but it remained steadfastly locked, like the building itself had clamped down on us, unwilling to let us go. My breath came in sharp gasps, and a sense of helplessness set in like a cold weight on my chest. The sound of frantic footsteps echoed in the hollow rooftop, and I turned to look at my friends. Their faces mirrored my own dread, eyes wide with fear. Sarah, still shaken from her trance-like episode, stumbled back from the door, her hands trembling as she reached out for me. "We need to get out of here now," she gasped. I nodded, my mind racing. We turned and ran, desperate to find another exit, but it was no use. The rooftop, which had once seemed like a vast open space, now felt impossibly small, the walls of the building looming over us like an impenetrable fortress. Every time we ran toward what we thought was an exit, the layout seemed to shift, as if the rooftop was shifting beneath our feet, trapping us in an endless loop. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath ragged, but there was no escape. No matter which direction we turned, the rooftop seemed to stretch out endlessly, the same doors and windows reappearing like twisted reflections in a mirror. It was as though we were stuck in a labyrinth that had no way out. That was when I saw it. Shadow. It had returned, but this time it wasn't just one figure. It was many. The shadows seemed to emerge from every corner of the rooftop, gathering around us like a thick fog, their forms twisted and distorted. The figure that had appeared earlier was no longer alone. It had companions, other figures, their faces obscured, their movements jerky and unnatural. The air grew colder, biting chill creeping through my skin as the spirits gathered, their presence suffocating. I froze, staring at the apparitions. Each one seemed to flicker in and out of existence, as though they were mere echoes of something darker. Their eyes were hollow, their expressions frozen in an eternal torment. It was clear now, this wasn't just a random haunting. This building had been cursed for decades, and we were trapped in the midst of something far worse than we could have imagined. "They're not just ghosts," I whispered, my voice trembling with realization. "They're trapped here, trapped like us." The shadowy figures began to move toward us, their unnatural movements quickening. Panic took over, and we bolted in every direction, desperate for an escape that seemed farther out of reach with each passing second. But no matter where we ran, the shadows followed, closing in on us, trapping us further in the nightmare. The tapping sound, the same noise that had echoed throughout the night, returned, growing louder and more insistent. It was coming from everywhere, as if the very walls of the building were alive with the sound of something unseen, something malevolent. "We have to find a way out," Sarah screamed, her voice cracking with fear. She grabbed my arm, pulling me toward a narrow staircase that led to what we hoped was the way down. We charged up the steps, hoping that the exit might be just beyond the next door. But when we reached the top, we found only darkness. The rooftop had become a maze, with doors leading to nothing, windows that seemed to disappear into endless blackness. We were running in circles, the building warping around us, as if it was reshaping itself to trap us forever. In that moment, the reality of our situation hit me with a crushing force. We were never meant to leave this place. The spirits had been waiting for us, watching us, pulling us into their web. They wanted us to join them, to become just another part of the haunted legacy of this forsaken building. With one last, desperate push, we ran toward the farthest corner of the rooftop, where a small door finally opened. It was as though the building had relented, giving us one last chance. We didn't hesitate. We ran through the door and into the hallway, our feet pounding against the cold concrete floor. We made it down the stairs and out into the streets, gasping for air, our minds reeling from what had just happened. The city around us was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant hum of traffic. It was over, or so we thought. We huddled together, not daring to look back. But as we walked away from the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't truly free. The fear, the terror, the unnatural presence, it was still with us, lurking just behind our thoughts. I couldn't stop hearing the tapping sound, the same sound that had filled the air that night. It followed us, echoing in the back of my mind, like a persistent drumbeat that wouldn't let me go. When I returned to my dorm, exhausted and shaken, I thought I could finally find some peace. But that night, as I lay in bed trying to block out the haunting memories, I heard it again. The tapping. It came from the distance, far off, as if it were still in the building. But it wasn't. I knew that sound too well. It was no longer just a noise. It was a warning. The rooftop, the spirits, the cursed building, it wasn't done with us. Whatever had followed us that night had found a way to latch onto us, and there was no escape. The fear settled into the pit of my stomach, a constant reminder that the horrors we faced that night were never truly gone. They had merely followed us, like shadows in the dark, waiting for the moment to strike again. The nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. As I sat in the dim light of my dorm room, the weight of everything that had transpired began to settle over me like a heavy blanket. The events that unfolded in room 13 and on the haunted rooftop were not just isolated incidents. There was a common thread weaving through both experiences, something deeper and more sinister than I had ever imagined. The realization came slowly, almost as if the pieces of a puzzle had been laid out before me, but only now did I fully understand the picture they formed. Both hauntings, the eerie presence in room 13 and the malevolent spirits on the rooftop, were connected by an ancient curse. I'd heard whispers about the university's dark past, but it had always seemed like mere folklore, stories told around campfires or late-night gatherings. Now, I knew it was much more than that. The buildings where these horrors had taken place, the dormitory, the abandoned rooftop, were built upon the grounds of an old burial site. Centuries ago, before the campus had been established, the area was home to a forgotten community, one that had been violently uprooted, its inhabitants buried where the university now stood. The restless spirits of the dead, trapped by time and unresolved anguish, had returned to exact their vengeance. And we, students, visitors, wanderers, were just the latest in a long line of souls to fall prey to their torment. What I had believed to be a simple haunting had evolved into something far more insidious. These spirits were not just looking for revenge. They were trapped in a cycle, cursed to torment anyone who ventured into their domain. Room 13, the abandoned rooftop, each of these spaces was a part of that curse. The spirits lingered there, bound to their final resting places, unable to move on, and they fed off the fear of the living. As I sat in silence, the truth of the curse seeped into my bones. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this was not just about supernatural forces, not just about ancient spirits and their restless wrath. There was a deeper lesson, one that had nothing to do with ghosts or curses. It was about fear. Fear is a strange thing. It's not always rooted in what we see or hear. Sometimes it's born from the things we cannot explain, the parts of ourselves that we try to suppress. The horrors we encountered, whether in the mirror in room 13 or the shadowy figures on the rooftop, were reflections of something much darker within us. These spirits were just the external manifestation of our fears, our uncertainties. They represented the parts of us that we can't control, the things that lurk in the corners of our minds, the unanswered questions, and the unresolved emotions that we hide from the world. I had faced the unknown, both in the form of these terrifying experiences and in the parts of myself that I didn't want to confront. I had been forced to reckon with the darkness that I had tried to ignore, and in doing so, I realized that fear wasn't something to be conquered or escaped. It was something to be understood. But even as I reflected on the nature of fear, one question remained. What are the spirits? What are the curse? Have we truly escaped? Was the nightmare over? The truth is, I don't know. The sounds, the whispers, the tapping, these things still haunt me. Even now, I still hear them in the quiet moments, in the spaces between my thoughts. The curse didn't end with our escape. It's still out there, waiting, lingering. The university, the campus, the buildings, they are all steeped in the past, in the blood of those long gone. And as much as we try to move forward, to escape the darkness, there are parts of us that are forever tethered to the past. The spirits of the dead are still out there, restless, seeking something they can never have. And we, the living, are forever bound to them, our fates intertwined with theirs. In the end, I wonder if we'll ever truly be free. Will the spirits ever find rest? Or will they continue to haunt the students who dare to enter these cursed spaces? The question lingers in the air, unanswered, like the tapping sound that echoes through the night. And as I sit here, alone with my thoughts, I can't help but feel that the curse will never truly let go. And neither will I.